What's up, guys? I'm on day 76 of the Odin project, and I had another productive day today. So yesterday, if you remember, I left off with exceeding my quota for Firebase. I got the leaderboard data to actually be retrieved from the database, so I left off on retrieve leaderboard as a function. I exceeded my Firebase quota, so I was doing something crazy where it was giving like 60,000 requests for the data to be read from the database to get that leaderboard data. I didn't know what was really going on, so this morning I was trying to focus in and trying to prevent that from happening, but I did it again. I exceeded my quota again with Firebase. So it caused me to do some research and to figure out what was going on. I knew it was the leaderboard function that was causing the problem, but I didn't know exactly why. But I figured it out. So I did two things to actually solve this problem. One was to separate out leaderboard into its own component. So I had yesterday everything essentially being done within app. I didn't have really any separate components for any of the screens. Leaderboard, I'm treating it as a screen, and so I created a separate component for that, and I also learned a bit more about side effects and how they can be used to prevent these kinds of issues. Specifically, side effects are anything that don't involve the calculations that are used for rendering, and that could be something like fetching data, interacting with an API, manipulating the DOM directly, things like that don't have to do with the calculations that are used for rendering. Those are called side effects, and within functional components within React, you use something called use effect to deal with those side effects. So essentially it decouples those side effects and those things that you want to do from the actual rendering. A bit more straightforward terminology. First, the rendering happens, and then the use effect runs anything that's within it, any of the side effects that you have within the use effect function. So let me show you what that looks like here on the screen. Quickly, the leaderboard data component, that's what we're in right now. The leaderboard screen component, this is what's going to actually cause the screen to come up. So we have some Firebase here. A lot of this is exactly the same as yesterday. It's just structured a little bit differently inside of this component. So we'll see that I have a leaderboard data state set within this component, and specifically the thing that I had trouble with was this block of code yesterday. It was its own function that kind of encapsulated this. It was called retrieve leaderboard. But now I have it within this use effect because I am getting this promise back from Firebase, so it's going to take some time to actually get the data come back because it's going to be asynchronous. And so I want to decouple that from the rendering so that it doesn't render a bunch of times. And specifically where I had trouble, so this was in a function, and I was actually calling that function in the return statement down here. So every time it returned, it would actually set the leaderboard data, and then the state would be manipulated, so then it would actually re-render everything again. And I think that's where the trouble was. I think it kept setting the data and then re-rendering, setting the data, re-rendering, setting the data, and then it would do that so fast, I would exceed my quota within like a couple minutes, essentially. So I did that yesterday in the afternoon, and I did that same thing this morning, and that's what caused me to go over my quotas for the 2 days. So I actually had to use another one of my Google accounts to set up a database for getting work done today. But that's where this use effect was coming in handy for getting around that. So separating out this side effect from the rendering so that all of this JSX will be returned and rendered. These HTML elements will be rendered. But the leaderboard data will be empty, so there won't be anything in the table body until the promise is returned from the database, and there's a fulfilled promise, which is what you see with this then statement. And once that actually happens, then it's going to set the leaderboard data, which is going to then tell React to re-render specifically this portion so that the actual data will come out. We'll see what that looks like later on. You'll get to actually see the full app today. but this is how I got around it. So using a component for leaderboard screen and also using the use effect. Having the component for the leaderboard screen was also helpful because it would set the data new every time you actually load the leaderboard screen, which is important because if you think about the flow of the app, right before the user submits their, right before they get to the leaderboard screen, the user is actually submitting their score to the database. So originally, one of the ways I thought about doing this was getting the leaderboard data to begin with, like at the beginning of the app or somewhere in the middle of the app. But that wasn't great because then I wouldn't have the user's data. And so that was not really going to work. But I do want it to be as live as possible data coming back so that if the user did make it to the top, then they'll actually show up on the top score of the database. So that was another nice side effect of using component for here. But let's take a look at what this looks like within the app and see how it's cleaned things up a bit. So what you'll see here is the logic that I have for the rendering of the app. And this was a bit more clunky yesterday because there was lots of lines of code in between these logic conditions. So we'll see, here's the leaderboard. It's a much cleaner down here. And I actually did this for the end screen, or what I'm calling the submit score screen for the component, and also the game screen. So if none of these conditions are met, then the game screen will pop up because these are all managed within state. So this is making things nice and clean. Let's take a look at the game screen. So I have these properties that are being passed to it. The game screen isn't really anything new. It's just put into a component and I'm using that to actually render it. So it's just cleaning things up a bit from a code perspective and from a readability perspective. And let's take a look at the submit score screen. So this is the other component that's being utilized for the end screen essentially. And again, this data is going to look very familiar. It's going to have another Firebase config and getting the data or setting the data for the user using this handle submit score function. So that handle submit score function is not new, but what is new here is this go to leaderboard function, which is actually defined within the app. And we'll see that I'm using these go to screen functions to actually transition the flow between each screen, to make the transitions between each screen. So let's go up just a second and take a look at these. So we have one for game screen, one for leaderboard, and one for start screen. I do not have one for the end screen because that is handled within the change character found function, which I'll get to that in a second. But let's start with the go to game screen. So we're on the start screen right now of Where's Waldo. So the user navigates to this page, they can click start and transition to the game screen. And so let's see what that looks like. Okay, now we're at the game screen, and how we did that was this transition from start to screen to game screen was with this set start screen to false. So the start screen has a state that is set, and it's set true initially so that the start screen will come up, and now we're going to set it to false when they click that start button. And then instead of rendering any of these, since they're all false, it's going to render the game screen component down here. In addition to transitioning, it's also going to actually start the timer for the score for the user. So we have the getting the date now, and it's also going to start the set interval, which is going to keep track of the progression of time that the user takes for actually finding all the characters. So I have that set to this interval variable, which is actually defined all the way up here. And I did that because I'm going to use that interval within this change character found function. This change character found function is what is utilized when the user is clicking on the characters and actually finding them. And specifically, it becomes relevant for the transition to the submit score screen. So when I find this last character, it's going to run this and specifically run this bit of logic to actually transition to the score screen. So I click this, and now we're at the score screen, and let's see what actually happened here. So there are no more characters to be found. So what I did was I used that interval variable that is set to clear the interval. That means essentially that that set interval timer essentially was stopped. And we want to stop it because we don't want it to progress any longer to alter the user's score. And we also want to set the end screen to true. So that's what's actually causing this bit of code down here to render the submit score screen component. And next we'll see that there's a go to leaderboard from this component, which is this function right here. It's a callback function because we're passing it as a property. And that's going to fire once the user actually submits their score. So if I put in my name or someone's name here and hit submit score, it's going to first set the end screen to false, and it's going to then set the leaderboard display to true. So we're getting rid of the end screen component, the submit score screen component, and actually rendering the leaderboard screen component. In addition to that, we're going to reset the state data for things that are relevant for the game. So this characters found state, we're going to set all the found properties to false, which is resetting the game essentially. And then also we're going to set the time for seconds, minutes, and hours to their baseline of 00. And so that's going to be important for when we actually transition the player back to the start screen. So they're on this page, they can look at their user score, they can see where they fell. So that last user did not make it to this page because they took too long. But they are prompted to play again if they want to try to make it to the leaderboard. This leaderboard component down here has the go to start screen, which is going to be right here. And that's just going to set the leaderboard display to false and the start screen to true. So it's almost, since we reset the states and we stop that timer with this clear interval function up here, it's going to be as if it was the function or the entire app was back to its base state essentially. And so we'll see what that looks like. It's pretty straightforward. We're back to the start screen. Wonderful. It was really satisfying to actually get to this and have this complete loop going. I actually got this to be working earlier, but it actually wasn't working exactly how I wanted it. So I didn't have that clear interval there. And so when the user then, after navigating back to the start screen from the leaderboard, the user could click this, but instead of getting this nice timer right here, they saw something like their previous score continuing to progress, in addition to another timer that was set also progressing along with that one. So they were actually both updating this at the same time. So at one point it was like 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then the next second it would be 15 seconds because there's two states that were set because I never cleared that previous set interval. So that's the importance of this clear interval right here, and it's also obviously the importance of setting the time variables and time states specifically back to their original positions. In addition to that, I also noticed that these characters were coming back as green as if they were all found, and so that's what prompted me to also reset the set characters found state as well. That's all I got for you guys today, though. I am very satisfied with what I got done today. There's definitely more that I have to do. Let me know, guys, if you actually encountered some of these similar problems. Specifically, raise your hand or let me know in the comments if you also exceeded your Firebase quota at least once when doing the Where's Waldo app, because it was actually, I was a little bit scared at first because I didn't know if my Google account was like connected to my credit card, and I didn't know if they were charging me. So I had to like shut everything down real quick and boot it back up like NPM, and luckily I didn't get charged. But yeah, let me know if you also exceeded your quota when doing this project. In addition to that, if you guys are interested in following mine and M's journey into web development, then definitely hit that like or hit that subscribe button. I'm also on Twitter, so if you guys are on Twitter, reach out and follow me there. I try to tweet about this as I'm going. And with that, I'll see you guys tomorrow.